So today we're making our stiff sourdough starter. Now what is a sourdough starter? Sometimes also called a mother dough. This is a microbial culture which actually performs the fermentation in our bread. So instead of using a man-made yeast that you would find at the supermarket, you use a starter or wild yeast that has been collected from the air and from the flour and some other unique ingredients we're using today. Now the unique thing about sourdough is it combines not only yeast but also bacteria. Now the sour in the sourdough name, the sour flavor is coming from the bacteria. As it outgasses, it's going to create lactic acid, and that gives our bread that lovely sour or tart flavor. Now what is the function of our starter? Now we first need to understand what active functional components of the sourdough starter contain and what their functions are. So in our sourdough starter, of course, it combines a combination of our wild yeast and our bacteria. Now the wild yeast is what creates the gas in our bread, creating a beautiful and fluffy loaf. And the bacteria component is what is creating our lactic and acetic acid, which gives our sourdough our sour flavor. Now these two components of our sourdough starter, what it needs to survive and thrive, of course, is a food source, temperature, so it likes to have a nice ambient temperature to cultivate and ferment, and of course time. So with our sourdough stiff starter today, we are making this from scratch, and to do that we are going to be creating what's known as a yeast water. Now the yeast water is going to start cultivating those two important ingredients which is in our sourdough starter, which is our yeast and our bacteria. And to do that, we're going to be using some natural ingredients. In front of me I have some dried fruits, which are some dates, and I also have an apple as well. Now it's very important, we are going to be making this in a jar, so you want to ensure that your jar is sterilized, and I have included how to do that in your recipe. Super simple, we're just going to cut up our apple into cubes. And straight into our sterilized jar. You want to make sure that the jar that you're using that you sterilized is now cool. We don't want to kill any of our yeast or bacteria. And we're just going to chop these dates, or you can also use dried figs or raisins, whichever you prefer. And I'm just cutting these in half. And our fruits and our yeast water is what is going to give not only the food to our yeast and our bacteria, but also on the outsides of the fruit, you will find naturally, they'll have natural yeast. So we want to start cultivating that. Now over the top, we're going to be adding some filtered water. And you just want to make sure that you have a little bit of space from the top of your jar to that water level. So I'm going to stick the lid on, and I'm going to give this a bit of a shake so we can start getting that yeast off the skin of our fruits here. And we're going to set this aside. You want to ensure that we don't have it anywhere where there's sunlight, because sunlight, the UV, can kill our yeast. So we want to ensure that it's in a dark and warm place. So it's winter here in Greece right now, so I am going to put this very close to my water heater just to keep it a nice warm temperature, and we're going to check this in 24 hours and see whether we have any activity starting. So it's our first day of our yeast water has been fermenting. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just give it a little shake. And we're going to open this up. I can already see some bubbles. It's actually very active. I wonder if you can see that. super active already, and I wonder if you can hear this. Just put it on my microphone so you can hear. Can you hear the bubbles? So we're on day 2 of creating our stiff sourdough starter from scratch. And we started off making our yeast water. As you can see, we have a lot of activity happening, lots and lots of bubbles. So I know that our yeast water is ready to go on to our next step. Now, do keep in mind when you are creating your yeast water, it can take anywhere from 1 day up to an entire week. We just want to continue checking it every day. And if we see lots of bubbles, like it looks like it's carbonated, then we are good to go. So we're going to strain this now. And it's important when we're first starting to make our stiff sourdough starter that everything that we are using is clean. So whether you're putting it through the dishwasher or sterilizing it, whether that be with just some hot water, cleaning with nice hot soapy water is very important because we don't want to incorporate any nasty bacteria into our product. So I'm just going to set this aside. Now that we have our beautiful bubbly yeast water, we're going to start incorporating that with some bread flour, so a high protein flour. And we're going to measure out 180 grams into our flour here. And I'm using this dough whisk, so you don't have to do this, you can do it all by hand, but I think it's kind of fun to use it. Just to combine everything together. Don't worry if it's starting to look a little bit shaggy, we're going to start kneading that now. Just incorporating everything together. And this is called a stiff sourdough starter because, as you'll notice, we're actually creating more like stiff dough as opposed to a liquid starter, which you would commonly see, out there on social media, on YouTube. So this is a little bit of a different way of how to make a sourdough starter or a mother dough, but it is a lot easier to care for. So once everything is all combined and you can't see any dry flour left, you can put it into your sterilized jar or clean container. So I'm going to pop this straight in. And I'm going to press this all the way down to the bottom with the lid on. I'm going to set this aside for 24 hours. So just pop it in a place away from the light. We don't want to kill our yeast. So just away from any light, you can cover it with a tea towel and somewhere where it's not too cool. So anywhere between like 20 degrees and 25 degrees is completely fine. We'll check back on our progress tomorrow. So what to do with your leftover yeast water? Well, this is actually a delicious carbonated drink with lots of healthy, good bacteria and yeast. Think of it as kind of like a kombucha or a naturally made beer. It doesn't have much alcohol or anything like that in there, but it is very delicious. So you can go ahead and enjoy this as a beverage over some ice, and it's super yummy. So it's been 24 hours since we mixed our yeast water with our bread flour, and as you can see, we have a ton of activity. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually just going to remove all of this first stage of making our starter into my bowl here. Oh, you can smell it too, very yeasty smelling. Now that I've got all of my starter out of my jar, I'm just going to give this a quick rinse with some warm water. So I just rinsed out my jar. I'm just getting some kitchen towel. It doesn't have to be completely clean, but just kind of getting most of that dough out of there. So choose how many loaves of bread that you would like to make before you refresh your starter for the first time. So I'm going to refresh my stiff starter to make enough bread for 2 loaves. So I'm going to weigh out 150 grams. And to that we're going to add 180 grams of water. And I like to get in there with my hands, just start loosening everything up just a little bit. Okay, now we're going to add our flour. Now I'm using a combination of bread flour, so that's our strong high protein flour, and also some whole wheat flour. So in your recipe it will call for you can use the full amount in bread flour, or you can replace 10% of that with a whole wheat flour. So a whole wheat flour can be an ancient grain, just whole wheat, spelt, it can be rye flour, whatever you like. I'm actually using a local flour here from Greece called Zieta, and this is somewhat of like an einkorn wheat or an ancient wheat that would have been used like hundreds of years ago. And the reason that we do add a small amount of the whole grain flour is it's going to feed the microbes and the yeast and all of our bacteria to get a really nice strong fermentation. So I'm going to add this as well. And we're just going to mix everything together. So once all of our flours and our starters have been incorporated well into our dough, we can place this back into our jar. And pop the lid back on. And now what I like to do is grab yourself a marker or a sticker or something, and we're going to mark where the level of our dough is right now, and we're going to put the time as well. So right now it's 11 a.m. and we want this starter to double in size within a 6 to 8 hour window. So we're going to check back on this in 6 hours, 6 to 8 hours, and we'll see where we're at. So all you need to do now is pop this in a warm place, something between 22 and 25 degrees Celsius, and we will check back in some time to see where we are at. And as you can see, it's puffed up, it's doubled in size, and this took me about 7 hours, so I know that my starter is very nice and active, and I can use it at this stage. Now, if your starter has doubled in size after the feeding within the 8 hour window, but say it's late at night and you don't have time to make bread, you can pop this into the refrigerator and just leave it there for up to 3 days, and you can use it to make bread directly from the fridge for like up to 3 days after that feeding.